Do you ever just feel connected? Like there's a rhythm to things inside you, maybe out in the world, something you can't quite put your finger on.
Or maybe the opposite. Some days you feel completely out of sync.
Exactly. Well, we've been digging into a really fascinating stack of sources lately, kind of bouncing between physics, biology, neuroscience, even philosophy. And our mission today is to really deep dive into this stuff and explore a pretty big idea. Is there some kind of fundamental, maybe even hidden connection between really subtle magnetic fields, biological resonance, and possibly consciousness itself?
That's the plan. We're going to take you on a bit of a journey, actually. We'll start by looking at how our bodies, right down to the cellular level, might be sensing and interacting with fields we usually just ignore.
Fields we don't even notice.
Right. Then we'll zoom into the brain, look at its own electrical bands, explore how resonance might fit into the consciousness picture.
Okay.
Then connect all that to the Earth's own natural electromagnetic rhythms, touch on some, pretty mind-bending theories about consciousness.
Always the fun part.
And finally, look at the practical side. Man-made fields, shielding, that kind of thing.
So it's a deep dive into these subtle forces that might just maybe link our inner experience to the actual pulse of the planet. Let's unpack this stack.
Okay, let's start really small. Down at the level of individual cells. The idea being explored here in the sources is that living systems might be way more sensitive to subtle electromagnetic fields than we generally think, like potentially reacting to fields as weak as nanotesla.
Nanotesla, okay, that's incredibly tiny, right?
Extremely small, yeah. And the sources talk about something called a membrane magnetic moment.
Sounds technical. What's the basic idea there?
Well, think about the cell membrane. It's not static, right? There's loads of stuff happening, proteins moving around in this sort of fluid environment.
Okay.
The hypothesis is that this movement, specifically how proteins might diffuse and interact, could actually create a tiny localized magnetic moment right there on the cell boundary.
So like the cell membrane itself gets a little magnetic personality. Is that a fair way to put it?
Kind of, yeah. And if this membrane magnetic moment exists, the sources suggest something pretty cool. Applying a weak but very specifically tuned magnetic field could potentially produce a discrete packet of energy.
And the surprising part?
The surprising part is they propose this energy packet could be equivalent to frequencies found in, get this, the visible light range.
Whoa, hang on. So you're saying magnetism at the cell level could somehow be linked to light?
That's the proposal. It's bridging these apparently separate things. And the sources also have this really interesting take on molecular signaling. How molecules talk within and between cells.
Right, the chemical messages.
Instead of just seeing it as a purely local thing, molecules bumping into each other, they suggest it might be a physical sign of something they call excess correlation.
Excess correlation?
Yeah.
Okay, that sounds complex. Mediated by photons in specific molecular shapes. What's the simple takeaway?
The core idea, I think, is that our usual picture might be incomplete. This excess correlation idea suggests information transfer isn't just a chemical handoff. It could be mediated by photons, actual light interacting with very specific molecular structures, which the sources call cosic configurations.
So cells might be communicating partly through a kind of light-based correlated interaction, happening faster, maybe over bigger distances than we thought.
That's the implication. A faster, potentially more coordinated communication network.
Okay, so tiny magnetic moments on cells, communication maybe using light link correlations. How does this play out between cells then?
Well, if each cell boundary really does have its own sort of rotating magnetic field, the sources suggest that if you get the timing right under specific conditions, you could encourage this excess correlation between different cells.
And that could lead to, what do they call it? Non-local effects.
Exactly, non-local effects.
Meaning they influence each other without actually touching?
Precisely. The idea is that information could be carried between cells using the spectral density resonances of photon wavelengths. Basically, specific light frequencies acting as a communication channel. It paints a picture of cells being, networked through these subtle field and light interactions.
That's a really different way to think about basic biology.
Yeah.
And didn't the sources mention a specific, almost kind of wild detail about photon emissions from the human head?
Oh yeah, that was one of their really striking findings. In one study they looked at, a subject showed this increase in very faint photon emissions. We're talking incredibly faint, like 10, 11 to 10, 12 watts per square meter.
Practically nothing.
Right, and it was coming specifically from the right side of their head. But here's the kicker. This emission was associated with a decrease in the Earth's local magnetic field by about 5 to 7 NT, measured about 15 centimeters away from the head.
Hold on, a change in the Earth's field linked to light coming out of someone's head. That's wild.
Yeah.
Did they pinpoint where in the brain it came from?
The spectral analysis pointed toward the right parahippocampal region as the likely source, sharing phase modulations with those photon emissions. It really suggests a direct measurable link between a specific brain area and the external magnetic environment.
Okay, let's just pause on another detail you flagged from the sources. This calculation they did, comparing a distance derived from fundamental physics constant related to this excess correlation idea, and it turning out incredibly close to the circumference of the Bohr magnet in orbit. What's the significance there? Is it just a coincidence?
Well, this is where things get really interesting, where different fields seem to bump into each other. The sources calculated this distance, 3.2 by 10 meters, based on parameters for excess correlation velocity and critical magnetic field intensity.
Okay.
And the circumference of the Bohr magneton's orbit, which is, a fundamental property tied to an electron's magnetic moment, is 3.3 by 10 meters. They're almost identical, differing by only about 3%.
Wow. That's too close to ignore, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's not just some random number. It relates to the basic properties of electrons, which are, well, everywhere in biology.
Exactly. It's highly suggestive. It implies there might be this deep connection between fundamental electron properties and the specific parameters governing these subtle field phenomena in biology. Like, electron behavior at the quantum scale might be intrinsically linked to how biological systems process information or generate these fields.
Okay, so if that's potentially happening at the cellular level, let's zoom out to the brain itself. We all know the brain runs on electricity, creating those brain waves we measure with EEG.
Precisely. And a really key idea in consciousness research focuses on synchronous neuronal firing. Different groups of neurons firing together in coordinated rhythms, combinations of gamma, beta, theta synchrony, things like that.
Right, and that's often proposed as a neural correlate of consciousness, an NCC, the brain activity that seems to go along with conscious experience.
Exactly. These coordinated electrical pulses across brain networks are seen as a potential foundation. And a really important concept here is resonance.
Right. Resonance, just to remind everyone, is basically when one system or force makes another thing vibrate or oscillate much more strongly at a particular frequency. Like pushing a kid on a swing, you need the right timing, the right frequency to make it go high.
Perfect analogy. And the crucial point the sources make is that living systems aren't just passive lumps. They can absorb and resonate with vibrations and waves. So the brain's electrical rhythms aren't just happening in isolation. They could be resonating with something else. Maybe even resonating across vast networks within the brain itself.
And the sources even suggest consciousness might emerge if these resonant vibrations somehow trigger quantum effects within the brain cells.
It's definitely pushing the boundaries there, yeah. Moving beyond just classical electrical signals to think about how resonance could perhaps facilitate or amplify quantum-level interactions that might be crucial for awareness.
And you mentioned the hippocampus earlier, with those photon emissions. It pops up again here, doesn't it?
It does. The sources describe it as one of the most electrically labile or dynamic regions in the brain.
Very active electrically.
Yes. And they note something interesting about its structure. The typical distances between cells in the hippocampus, around 75 micrometers or so, fall within a range that, according to the physics they discuss, might allow access to representations in what's called a real Hilbert space.
Hilbert space, that's a mathematical concept often used in quantum mechanics, right? So the physical layout of the hippocampus might be particularly well suited for these potential field-based or quantum effects.
That's the hypothesis they're exploring, yes. Which leads us neatly into electromagnetic field theories of consciousness, EM2-Kinxes for short.
Okay, EM2-Kinxes. So instead of just saying consciousness comes from the neurons firing, these theories are proposing that the electromagnetic field created by all that firing is the conscious experience itself.
That's the core idea, yeah. They build on that finding of synchronous firing being a key NCC. EM2-Sleaze suggests that the shared resonance across these firing neuronal networks creates a unified electromagnetic field, and that field is essentially the seat of our macro-conscious awareness.
So the resonance allows different brain areas to kind of lock together.
Exactly. To achieve a phase transition in information flow, allowing for much richer, more integrated processing. That shared resonance creates the unified field, which is the experience.
it kind of fits with that famous idea from physics, information is physical.
Right, if information is integrated in our consciousness, it has to be physically integrated somehow.
Precisely. Information stored in matter, like bits on a computer chip, is discrete. But a field is continuous.
So a field might offer a different way to bind information together into a single, unified, conscious state.
That's the thinking. And coherence field theory, which the sources mentioned, goes even further. It suggests brainwaves might not just be a side effect, an epiphenomenon.
Like steam from a train engine. Right, but they might actively orchestrate the molecular machinery of the brain through magnetic interactions.
Wow. So the field itself could be causal, like a roving concentration of gamma activity, maybe. Could be a primary driver of our moment-to-moment awareness, maybe even our sense of volition or free will.
That's the implication. It gives the brain's EM field a much more central, active role in actually generating conscious experience.
Okay, this is fascinating. Let's shift gears a bit now, moving from inside the brain outwards to the environment around us. Because the Earth itself has its own rhythms, doesn't it? Its own electromagnetic pulse.
Absolutely. And the most well-known of these are the Schumann resonances, the SRs. You can sort of think of them as the Earth's natural electromagnetic heartbeat.
Naturally occurring extremely low-frequency waves, ELF waves. Where exactly are they?
They exist in that big spherical cavity between the Earth's surface and the lower edge of the ionosphere, roughly 50 kilometers up. That whole space acts like a giant natural waveguide or resonance chamber.
And what keeps them going?
Primarily lightning discharges. There's lightning happening constantly all over the globe, maybe 50 to 100 strikes every single second. That global electrical activity pumps energy into this cavity and keeps the resonances ringing.
So the Earth isn't just a quiet rock. It has this dynamic electromagnetic environment constantly being energized. And the sources talk about research linking these Earth rhythms to us, to human biology.
Yes, some really interesting studies. They've monitored Schumann resonances and human brainwaves, EEG, at the same time. And what they found was pretty remarkable.
What was that?
Variations in the human EEG patterns seemed to mirror changes that were happening in the SRs. And significantly, the correlations were strongest when solar and magnetic activity were higher.
So when the sun's acting up, potentially affecting the Earth's field, our brainwaves seem to track that somehow.
That's what the correlation suggests, yeah. It hints at a sensitivity, maybe a resonant connection. And here's a really compelling detail the sources highlight. Many of the Schumann resonance frequencies show up clearly in the spectral profiles of typical human brain activity.
Okay, that's interesting in itself.
But even more striking, the amplitudes, the actual strength of the signals are comparable, roughly in the 1 to 2 picotesla range for both.
Wait. So the strength of the Earth's natural electromagnetic hum at certain frequencies is roughly the same as the strength of our brain activity at those same frequencies.
That's the finding. And that correspondence in amplitude is highly suggestive, isn't it? It points towards a plausible mechanism for interaction or resonance. It's not just a statistical correlation if the signal strengths actually match up.
That is suggestive. And it wasn't just brainwaves, right? The sources mentioned links to our autonomic nervous system too.
That's right. The system that controls things like heart rate, breathing, digestion, the involuntary stuff.
Like through heart rate variability, HRV?
Exactly. HRV measures the tiny variations between heartbeats, and it gives you a window into the balance between your fight or flight sympathetic system and your rest and digest parasympathetic system. Studies showed that daily autonomic activity, reflected in HRV, seems to be affected by changes in solar and geomagnetic activity.
Any specific example?
Yeah, one study showed a clear correlation between the parasympathetic activity, specifically the HRV-HF power, often linked to relaxation in healthy participants, and the time-varying aspects of the Earth's magnetic field. They even showed a graph where the correlation was visually striking when they inverted the magnetic field data.
So our heart rhythms, regulated by our nervous system, appear to be subtly dancing along with the planet's magnetic fluctuations.
That's what the data indicates. And it makes sense in a way because solar activity directly impacts the Schumann resonances and the ionosphere. For instance, a jump in the solar activity index is linked to a small but measurable rise in the main SR frequency, and also changes the effective height of the ionosphere, altering that resonance cavity.
It really paints this picture of a nested system, doesn't it? Events out in space, like solar flares, influence Earth's electromagnetic environment, and that environment might be resonating with and influencing our internal biology from brain waves right down to heart rhythms.
Absolutely. Taken together, these findings strongly suggest a potential information transfer, or maybe a resonant coupling, between the magnetic fields of the Earth and our own biological systems. We might not just be living on the planet, but somehow resonating with it.
Okay, so if our internal biology and the external planetary environment are potentially resonating together in these subtle ways, what might that imply for something as big and mysterious as consciousness itself?
Well, that brings us right up against one of the toughest nuts to crack in consciousness research. The combination problem, sometimes called the binding problem.
Right. How do all the separate little bits of brain activity, this neuron firing, that brain region lighting up, how do they all combine to create the single, seamless, unified subjective experience that we have?
Yeah.
How do the parts become the whole?
It's like asking how millions of individual pixels on a screen become a coherent picture, or how individual notes form a melody. And resonance theory offers a potential angle here. The idea is that shared resonance might be the glue. It's what allows different parts of the brain, maybe processing different aspects of experience, to synchronize their activity and effectively combine their information. This shared resonance could enable a kind of sudden shift, a phase transition in the speed and richness of information flow.
So consciousness isn't just the sum of the parts, but maybe emerges when those parts achieve a certain kind of resonant harmony.
That's the proposal. It's the resonance that binds them. And taking a physics perspective, the sources suggest we should think of the brain, fundamentally, as an electromagnetic field object, right from the atomic level upwards.
Not just a collection of cells, but a dynamic field.
Exactly. And they propose that many existing theories of consciousness might actually just be describing specific behaviors or properties of this overall EM field generated by the brain.
So different theories might be looking at different aspects of the same underlying field phenomenon.
Potentially, yeah. Now, another really fascinating concept that came up in the sources is agency, our sense of being able to consciously choose and control our actions in the moment.
Our feeling of free will, essentially.
Right. And the sources put forward this really intriguing idea. Instead of agency simply evolving over generations in the slow Darwinian sense, maybe it originates as a kind of transfer from evolution to the individual, happening dynamically in real time.
A transfer, how would that even work?
Through ongoing real-time feedback processes, crucially involving learning and memory. The suggestion is that agency is essentially an algorithmic process that the brain has to learn.
Learn agency.
Yeah, the sources use some pretty provocative phrasing like, the brain must learn to be conscious, and similarly, selfness must be learned.
Wow, so consciousness and our sense of self aren't just passively switched on, they're active processes that develop and are refined through our interactions and learning.
That's the powerful implication. And it has huge consequences for how we think about development, learning, maybe even artificial intelligence. Now, if consciousness is tied to resonance and these field effects, could it possibly extend beyond just one brain?
You mean like shared consciousness?
The sources touch on this speculative idea, yeah. Synchronization between different brains, perhaps mediated by shared external electromagnetic fields.
Like two people's brains potentially falling into sync because they're both immersed in, say, the same fluctuations of the Earth's field.
That's the sort of concept they float, inter-individual neural synchronization, via shared external or exogenous entrainment. This kind of interbrain resonance, they speculate, could potentially make possible things like group consciousness or maybe nested consciousness.
That sounds very sci-fi, but grounded in this resonance idea.
Extremely speculative, as the sources emphasize, and needs a lot more investigation. But the core idea that our minds might resonate not just internally, but potentially with each other via the environment. Well, it's pretty mind-blowing to consider.
Definitely. And there was also a philosophical angle mentioned.
Yes, just briefly touching on contrasting worldviews. The standard materialistic view often sees life as, an incredibly complex machine that arose largely by chance.
Right.
This was contrasted with the Vedantic perspective, which posits that the ultimate origin of everything is sentient, is consciousness itself, and that life as we know it is a more primitive or reproductive manifestation of that.
A fundamentally different starting point.
And importantly, the Vedantic view, as cited from texts like the Bhagavad Gita, apparently refutes the idea of consciousness being singular. It suggests a plurality, multiple consciousnesses.
So that adds another layer to the whole puzzle. Are we investigating one thing called consciousness,
Well,
or potentially many different forms or levels?
it certainly complicates the picture. Now, let's try and ground some of this discussion in things that affect us daily, like the ever-increasing presence of man-made electromagnetic fields, EMFs.
Right, from Wi-Fi, phones, power lines, it's everywhere. And there's growing interest and maybe concern about potential health effects like electrohypersensitivity, EHS.
Exactly. The sources mention studies looking into potential non-thermal effects not just caused by heating tissue, things like genetic damage, oxidative stress, changes in behavior. But they also stress that currently, more robust evidence is really needed to definitively link these exposures to specific human diseases.
So the jury is still out, scientifically speaking, on many specific health claims.
For many specific diseases, yes. Although oxidative stress does seem to pop up frequently in research looking at biological impacts, it's a complex area.
Given these concerns, though, people naturally look for ways to protect themselves. Shielding comes up a lot.
Right. And the basic physics is straightforward. You use conductive materials, usually metals with free electrons, to reflect or absorb electromagnetic waves. That's the principle of a Faraday cage. A metal box blocks external fields.
And we see this applied in products, right? Metal grids or special paints for buildings, films for windows, shielding curtains, even clothing or bed canopies.
Yeah, or sometimes materials like rubber mixed with iron powder. They all aim to reduce exposure by blocking or diverting the incoming EM waves.
But the sources highlighted a really critical trade-off, didn't they? Especially with extensive shielding.
Yes, and this is a really important point they raised. While this kind of shielding can be effective at blocking man-made EMFs, if you do it comprehensively and permanently, like turning your whole house into a Faraday cage, it also significantly blocks or attenuates the natural non-polarized EMFs we were just talking about, including those Schumann resonances, the Earth's natural background hum.
So you might block the artificial signals you're worried about, but you might also be blocking the natural signals that some research suggests our biology might actually be attuned to or even need.
That's the potential downside, exactly. And they pointed to evidence from experiments done way back in the 1960s and 70s in heavily shielded underground bunkers.
What did those show?
Those studies suggested that blocking out these natural fields could actually have negative impacts on people's biological rhythms, their circadian clocks, and maybe general well-being.
Which implies that just blocking everything might not be the ideal long-term strategy?
That seems to be the conclusion the sources lean towards. Avoidance of strong man-made EMF sources, where practical, is generally presented as maybe a safer first step than going for heavy, permanent shielding.
And if shielding is used?
The suggestion is that minimal or intermittent application might be theoretically safer. The sources also cast some doubt on the effectiveness of small patches, chips, or minerals, often marketed as protective, based on the physics involved.
And they highlighted an area for future research.
Yes, an urgent need, they suggested, to look into combining shielding technologies with specialized generators. Generators that could emit very weak pulses designed to mimic the frequency, intensity, and waveform of the natural atmospheric resonances, like the Schumann ones.
So the idea would be to block the artificial noise while potentially reintroducing the natural signal that the body might benefit from.
That's the concept, yeah, trying to get the best of both worlds. The sources also touched on other areas where EM fields and materials are used, like in biomedical engineering.
You mentioned electrospinning technology earlier.
Right. That's a technique for creating these ultrafine nanofibers. Interesting finding here. While simple electrospun conduits didn't seem to help much with nerve regeneration in animal studies, in vivo, when they used multi-layered scaffolds that actually incorporated iron oxide magnetic nanoparticles, F3O4.
So adding tiny magnetic bits into the scaffold.
Exactly. Those scaffolds apparently did promote significant recovery, morphological, functional, electrophysiological, of regenerated sciatic nerves in those animal models. It's another hint that magnetic materials interacting with biology can have tangible effects.
And connecting back to potential health impacts again, you mentioned studies looking at developmental effects of specific low-frequency magnetic fields.
Yes, showing that even quite subtle fields might have measurable biological consequences, but it really depends on the specifics, the frequency, the intensity, the timing, the biological state of the organism.
So it's not a simple dose-response relationship always.
Not necessarily. For example, they cited studies exposing developing rats to a 7 Hz square wave magnetic field at different low intensities, 1 nanotesla, 50 NT, 500 NT, sometimes with other substances involved that affect the nitric oxide system.
And the effects varied?
They did. For instance, the 50 NT group that just got water ended up with a larger adult body weight compared to controls. And there were complex interactions between the field strength and other factors influencing brain weight and testicular weight. It just underscores that these subtle fields can interact with biology, but the outcome isn't always straightforward.
And this brings us right back, full circle almost, to our internal biological rhythms, like our circadian clocks. We know metabolic oscillations are deeply linked to our environment, especially things like light exposure and when we eat.
Absolutely. Messing with those rhythms, like decoupling when we eat from the natural environmental cycles, is increasingly linked to negative health outcomes like obesity and metabolic syndrome.
We see this clearly with shift work, right? That misalignment between the central clock in the brain and the clocks in peripheral organs is really detrimental to metabolic health.
Definitely. It just hammers home how important environmental synchronicity is for our biology to function optimally. And perhaps, as these sources collectively suggest, the Earth's subtle electromagnetic rhythms are part of that crucial environmental context we're tuned into.
It really suggests a much broader definition of environment than just the obvious things like light and temperature, doesn't it?
It certainly opens up that possibility.
Wow. Okay, we have covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've journeyed from potentially sensitive single cells through the resonant electrical fields of the brain, connected that to the Earth's own electromagnetic pulse, and even touched on theories of agency and maybe group consciousness.
Yeah, we've tried to piece together this picture where our internal biological fields, our sort of bioelectricity, might not be operating in isolation. It seems potentially interwoven with the external electromagnetic environment, everything from tiny local fields right up to the planet's global rhythms.
And this connection, this resonance, might be fundamental not just to basic biological processes, but maybe even to how we experience consciousness, our sense of self, maybe even collective experiences.
It definitely makes you reconsider our place, doesn't it? Maybe we're not just isolated biological units walking around on the Earth, but are part of a larger resonant system, fundamentally connected to the Earth's rhythms.
And that this resonance isn't just a passive reflection, but could be actively playing a role in shaping our awareness, our connection to each other, and to the planet itself.
That's the profound implication hanging in the air, I think.
So maybe here's the thought to leave you, our listener, with today, something to mull over long after this deep dive finishes. If consciousness is, at its core, somehow linked to resonance, and if our own biological systems are potentially resonating with the Earth's natural electromagnetic frequencies, what does that truly mean about our connection? Our connection to each other, our connection to the planet, and maybe the very nature of consciousness itself.
Is consciousness something that happens purely inside us, confined within our skulls? Or is it something larger, something that emerges, at least in part, from this dynamic, resonant relationship between us and the world we inhabit?